Foundation for quite a while, and he has also been kind enough to sometimes lend a hand to Carboncopies, and it's so wonderful that you can come and do one of our journal clubs this time around. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. And I'd actually like to, be involved going forward too.
Yes, we look
Um,
forward to
all right, you ready for me to go?
that.
All right, so I'm going to kind of do a general discussion of integrated information theory, but I also specifically picked out the article on what is the integrated information theory of consciousness, a catalog of questions by Adam Potts, who's a philosopher, that just came out this year. So just a little structure of what I'm going to talk about. I want to give an overview of IIT, and it's kind of linked in a little bit, but I don't want to make it too long. And then I want to kind of go over some critiques. The first one is based on the Potts paper about the measures of consciousness, the quality, or quantity and qualitative content. And then I want to talk a little bit about just some other theories based on some other papers and some of the things that I have written, and go over a little bit about that. And then Keith is on the line too. So if we have time, maybe talk a little bit about the simulation argument and the feed-forward network arguments as well. So let me try to give a brief summary of integrated information theory. So IIT claims that consciousness is a fundamental property of the physical world. It is generated by the causal relations between particles and fields at the level of interaction indicated by the theory equations of IIT. Now, I highlighted that part because that's, I think, an issue. Therefore, causally identical systems may have divergent levels of consciousness, and that's another, I think, major point. So I'm going to throw in a few critiques. I can't help it while I'm trying to overview the theory, but the level of interaction indicated by the theory is never made clear, and we'll come back to that. Oh, and by the way, just please ask me, questions. I want this to kind of be a discussion, so absolutely interrupt me as we go along. So it's kind of two aspects of IIT. I didn't know what to call, aspects or elements or whatever. There's the mathematical equations, which is always the second half of these papers, where it's kind of getting more and more elaborate. And there are equations to calculate phi and also equations to calculate the shape in Q space or qualia space. And I'll talk about that more here in a minute. But then there's a question, so where do these equations come from? Do they come from the theory, which we'll talk about here in a second? And it's kind of hard to figure that out. And I don't think they're really derived from anywhere specifically, and they're not empirical. So I think that's an issue. And I really have a hard time with that question, where those equations come from. So let me talk. So what Tononi and Koch have said is just, we'll look at the latest version, which is IIT 3.0, based on an article that came out in 2012, where I think they attempt to maybe put this more on a foundation and answer some of these questions. So I'm going to be talking or reviewing this particular formulation. So in that paper, they go over 5 axioms and then 5 postulates. Actually, I might be wrong about the 5, but that number may not be correct. And then from there, then go on to the equations. So these axioms are chosen from phenomenology, and postulates. At some point, I know I've heard Koch say that these follow from the axioms, and I'll comment on that here in a minute. And then I've already talked about the equations. So,
Mike,
yeah.
quick question. Postulates versus axioms. I was thinking of trying to ask Christoph about that, and then I held off because I read up on a number of sites about the difference between axioms and postulates, and it seemed like in modern day there's a habit of not making much of a difference between them anymore. So
that's what I figured out as well, that they're Yep,
yeah.
that's because I was rereading the 3.0 paper, and that's the same conclusion I came up with, is that they're all basically axioms, which I'm gonna get to, but yeah, I came to that same conclusion. So I'm gonna come back to I'm gonna go over each postulate really quickly, but first let me talk about the predictions, measures of the theory. So you've got phi, which is the amount of consciousness in any system. This is calculated as the integrated information of the system minus the integrated information of all the independent components. And then the formulas of this were initially based on Shannon information. then evolved into equations of entropy, the EMD, Earth mover distance equation. And then the latest papers really getting into some complex mathematics, some of these statistics that try to include causality in the equations. And the second problem is, or second, not problem, the prediction measure of IIT is the shape of the system in Q space or qualia space. And it's noted a few times that this is the qualia of that experience, and we'll come back to that. But this is a shape in the space of all possible causal possibilities of the system. Again, based on the mathematics, when you set up these measures, then you get a large multi-dimensional space. And they've stated, both Tononi and Koch have stated, in papers and interviews, that this experience is identical to the space. They're the same thing. So some sort of identity theory, and I'll come back to that. So I want to kind of go over the axioms and the postulates, which we've already agreed they're all basically axioms. So the issue with axioms is, of course, that we all have to agree on them, that they're self-evident, and we can all agree. And then in papers and in person, they've talked about how these come from phenomenology, and that's, you got to be careful there, because phenomenology means a lot of different things. You can go back to continental philosophy, basically Husserl, who has a whole school of phenomenology. But then in modern times, analytical philosophers, which Anglo-American philosophers, also use this term, and some of the newer continental phenomenologists use this term, and it can kind of merge into. I think the latest analytical and continental philosophy use this kind of in a similar way. And specifically, I think Koch has commented that this is from the continental phenomenology. But so let's go over the axioms. So the first is existence. Consciousness exists. It is an undeniable aspect of reality. And Koch is a big fan of Descartes, and he often, comments about, Descartes' famous lines about "I think, therefore I am." Now, the issue I have with this is just, this would be nice if this was a definition, but it's not. Then they talk about composition. Consciousness is compositional, structured. Each experience consists of multiple aspects and various combinations. Okay, well, that seems relatively straightforward. Information, consciousness is informative. Now, here's where I would say, okay, the next step should be you talk about intentionality. Each conscious experience is about something in the world. But instead, they take a very different approach and say that each experience differs in a particular way from other possible experiences. So this whole theory, in a way, when you go back to the earlier versions, is based on this idea that consciousness is something's conscious by what it rules out. And so a few of these debates, Tononi has talked about, staring at a blank wall, and how that generates, as human beings staring at a blank wall generates this rich conscious experience, because it differs from all the other possible visual experiences that you could have. And so I want to come back to that. And then integration, consciousness is integrated. Each experience is irreducible to non-interdependent components. Maybe. Okay. Exclusion. Now, this quote axiom is actually the one I have the most issues with. I think it's very ad hoc. So exclusion is that consciousness is exclusive. Each experience excludes all others. At any given time, there's only one experience having its full content, rather than a superposition of multiple partial experiences. And so where this axiom was added, because a lot of people criticized the earlier versions, where any system could have basically almost an infinite number of conscious systems, and it's really impossible to um, specify which is the conscious system. So they made that an axiom. And again, I think that is very ad hoc, and of all the axioms, that's the one I think I have the most issue with. Other than also the intentionality should be in here, because that probably is the most important phenomenological aspect of consciousness. Consciousness is about something. And if you had that axiom, then you'd have to talk about representation, which they can completely ignore, which leads to a lot of the problems in IIT. So let's talk about the postulates. They talk about these paralleling the phenomenal axioms, but basically they're just self-evident. These are more axioms. So they talk about existence. Mechanisms exist or in a state exist. So they just kind of define what they're talking about as a system. I mean, and that's fine. That's more of a definition. In composition, elementary mechanisms can be combined into higher order ones. That's fine. These are just sort of definitions. And then they get back to information. A mechanism can contribute to consciousness only if it specifies differences that make a difference within a system. Um, and again, this gets back to, I think, that initial. Um,
Could I ask a question about
sure.
the additional one? I'm sorry if this means we have to go back a slide, but
No, no problem.
I'm wondering how the postulate about composition, how that interacts with, works together with the exclusion principle. Um, because the exclusion principle is making it out to be one single experience, which is
Yep.
indivisible in a sense. But
Yep.
here you have composition of elementary parts.
Yeah, and I think that's a big tension in the theory is that you set up these systems and you try to find what's the maximum integrated information, but then what if you add one more neuron or one more circuit, then your system completely changes, and so you run into some really big major problems. And there's been some discussion about this. Um, yeah, well, you get into the problem of like, okay, are you and I together another system? What's to say that Randall and Mike together aren't bigger phi? And so you get into all of these, problems, and I don't think they're really answers. But um, what the exclusion axiom was supposed to do was sort of solve this. But again, I think it's very ad hoc, so it doesn't answer these more basic questions.
I'm sorry to repeat something that might have been clarified. Are these axiom? Do they call them axioms or postulates? What's their terminology?
Both. So
Okay,
you've got
okay,
the
all right,
five
that's fine.
axioms. Yeah, that's the
Oh,
existence, composition, information, integration, exclusion. Those are the five axioms.
oh, and there's also okay. So there's
And then
10
there's
plus.
also postulates. And then, Randall and I were talking about
No,
what's the difference.
okay, okay.
And so I guess some of these
Um,
postulates are like definitions and some of them are axioms.
so my question was, I'm actually not clear on this. Were these uh, bullet points that either Tanani or Koch put down, or did they retrieve these from the broader psychological literature, and say they were going to start with these to build their theory? Like, did they come up with their own axioms and postulates, and everyone else just sort of thinks that they got it right, or were they pulling these from elsewhere?
Well, with the first axioms, they supposedly got these all from phenomenology, which, I think you could,
That's fine.
phenomenology is
That's
a huge
fine.
literature. Yeah.
Are there grounded references? Like, I mean, is this actually something that people in phenomenology agree on? Like, these are the five?
Well, yeah, I don't think anybody agrees on anything in phenomenology. I think that's the one of the
I'm just
problems.
curious how much of an external source they're starting from, or if they created their whole theory, including the axioms themselves.
Well, no, some of these are definitely from phenomenology, but I think they cherry picked a little bit. That's why I talked about the
Okay.
intentionality axiom. I
Yeah,
definitely think they cherry picked. And no, I think the postulates are more of an issue because it's okay. These first two are definitions. That's fine. You can define a mechanism as a state or whatever. But then you start getting back into information, and the difference that makes a difference is I know that's a mantra from certain information theories and whatnot. But again, they view this in a very different way. So they're not talking about representation. They're taking this insight about things that you can rule out, which is an interesting take on information.
it's true. And in the conversation with Christoph, he made a point to say that when they're talking about information, they're not talking about Shannon information, which I thought was a little weird because he goes off and describes this as something new. But at the same time, of course, Shannon and
Yeah.
communication channels does have a lot to say about code books.
Well,
Having a
yeah.
code book that encodes your data is kind of like this whole exclusion thing that he's talking about, that you have 1,000 things encoded and you're picking one of them, and therefore the number that you're giving to point to a specific place in the code book is informative in that sense.
Yeah,
um,
I agree. That comes very much from um, Shannon information. Yeah, statements like differences that make a difference.
but another thing that I found complicates is, as you mentioned, people don't agree on what phenomenology is or what you describe in phenomenology, and it's very clear that Koch and Tononi are coming from a different direction than many others. And again, Christoph made a point to point out that, say, in his opinion, something like global workspace is coming from the point of view that, okay, we have certain brain areas or brain structures and they must do certain things. So taking the brain as the basis
Hmm.
and then working towards a theory from there rather than phenomenology. Whereas IIT comes from experience, from, cogito ergo sum, as he says, of course. And so in that sense, it's more direct and more from the phenomenology up, not making any assumptions about brain mechanisms, etc. So from his point of view, it's more phenomenological
Hmm.
than something like global workspace. Whereas if you talk to someone like Michael Graziano, he says exactly the opposite. He says that IIT is not working with phenomenology at all, but that it is based on some, you know, basically personal hunches and then working out from there. Um, Whereas the phenomenology is something that you would find in places like global workspace or his own attention schema theory. And that is, I think, because when some people talk about phenomenology, they're talking about verifiable things that third persons uh, can observe and can measure in some sense. At
Well,
least that's the
exactly.
impression I'm getting. And when Tononi and Christoph are talking about it, they seem to be talking about first person experience, the cogito ergo sum thing, which of course is it's very different in the sense that the third person can't say much about that.
I think exactly. I think that's a great point. And I come up with the terminology that, IIT is a theory of first person consciousness. They want to talk about, what basically is unique to each person. And Graziano and, Bars talk about third person consciousness. They're looking at, from my perspective, how do I define consciousness in you? And that's, using things like the attention schema theory or the global workspace. And that is, and that's how science works. So they can go on to be scientific. What Tononi and Cog are starting with is this first, person experience where, it's not clear because that's not how science works. So how are you going to go with this? And that leads to some of, major issues, which I'm definitely going to touch on. But I think you're absolutely correct on that. Any other questions, or then I'll continue on with the postulates here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, like I said, this kind of expanded into a more larger introduction to IAT. And then, so information part two is where they get into, okay, so the qualia space, and the differences that make a difference. And they talk about a conceptual structure. This is a constellation of points and concept space, blah, blah, blah. But this is getting at, um, that second part of the theory, um, which, that's quite a postulate just to say that's self-evident. And they talk about integration is also a postulate in addition to an axiom. A mechanism can contribute to consciousness only if it specifies a cause-effect repertoire that is irreducible to its components. And then integration irreducibility um, is assessed by partitioning the mechanism and measuring what difference it makes. So these are kind of, I guess, the postulates are sort of defining how they want to set up integrated information theory. Well, there's also exclusion, which is very similar to the axiom of exclusion. So I'm just going to skip over that. Identity. And this is they come up with this clever acronym, mix or mice or whatever is generated by the elements is experience. I just wanted to highlight that in red because this is in the 3.0 paper. This complex of elements is identical to experience. Just to point that out. Oh wow, more postulates. All right, so more of the identity. I'm just going to keep going. Okay, so let's get to the first paper. So I like the Potts paper because I think it's a different approach that a lot of the other critiques have been in the literature, and it's kind of asking some basic questions. So I talked about the two main measures: the quantity of consciousness and the qualitative content. So what Potts wants to look at is, well, how are you defining these two measures? And I think really points out some major issues with these two measures. And if your theory doesn't get your measures right, then you're not going to get anywhere else with the theory. And so I think that's a pretty devastating critique that I hadn't seen put in this exact way before. So I think it's actually a really good paper. So quantitative consciousness, that's the phi. I guess we've already talked about that, so we don't need to go over that again, the amount of information. And so what Hans wants to ask is that what does level of consciousness mean? I mean, you say phi is the level of consciousness. Well, what level of consciousness could mean a lot of different things, and he gives several dimensions. You talk about intensity level, noise, loud versus soft noise, loud noise, bright color, dull color. And plenty of stuff has been written about this in psychophysics. I mean, there's a lot we know about this. Determinacy level, they differ in the determinacy of their content. Look at a tomato in front of you and versus rotating around, etc. That can make a difference. Complexity, conscious experience is differ in the complexity. You could have a simple experience like a minty smell versus a complex visual street scene in Paris. So that's important. And then there's access. um, there's variation in cognitive uptake. How much of this experience is, or this information is represented by experience and working memory? I mean, that could definitely be a level of consciousness. um, and so he asks, just a simple question, well, what do they mean? And then he tries to look at some of their writings and see if he can pen exactly what they're saying. um, but as I just said, as long as integrated information theorists do not address this question, we literally do not know what they're claiming, so their theory is untestable. And I think that's true of any kind of scientific theory. If you don't define your measures, you're kind of in trouble. So, and he kind of
Um,
analyzes this and
I
says, yeah, go ahead.
just a quick point that I did in fact ask Christoph the question about what does level of consciousness mean,
Uh-huh.
and I'm paging through my very badly scrawled notes right now because I wanted to try to remember what exactly he said. I can't remember the exact answer. All I remember is that when I posed the question, is this about intensity? Is this
Hmm.
about complexity? Is this about da da da? He went off in a different direction with that.
Hmm.
Um, he said that it wasn't specifically any one of those, but I can't. We'll have to rewatch the video
Well,
of the
I think
interview.
that's what Potts concludes too. Is like he doesn't really mean any of these things because some of the things are true for some levels, but then they would contradict that as a definition. So they may mean something totally different, but it's not clear what that is. So so he talks about so intensity or complexity level. He doesn't think that that's what they're talking about because they have that blank wall experience being highly conscious, but that is
I just
not very
found
complex.
a note that I made.
Okay.
He said phi is the quantity of consciousness. It's the causal power in a sense.
Okay, that's very different. Okay. Not sure what that means though.
Yeah, throughout the interview, he clearly equates the concept of phi, the amount of
Causal power, huh?
non-reducible. Well, he does use the term causal power. I think what I latched onto with reference to what you're talking about right now was this quality quantity question. He definitely used the notion of quantity. Like he actually wants to map, the degree of the phi metric to the sort of amount of consciousness going on.
Well, and and they've written about these, conscious detectors where they're looking at, people in a
Precisely.
vegetative state, and they're saying they want to get this magic number.
Yeah,
But
it's
you got to
obvious where he wants to do with it. It's actually,
yeah.
it's a laudable goal to try to come up with, sort of a consciousness machine. So looking for this clear scalar metric. I understand the motive. Regardless of whether we agree with him, I do think he was saying that phi sort of is the amount of consciousness. You can draw that
Well, yeah, I think
correlation.
that's their motive is, you get this person in a vegetative state, and then you calculate phi, and then you see how conscious they are. But then the problem is, then you say, well, you get back to all these other questions. Are you talking about intensity? Or are they just having this massive experience of blankness that is some, high level of consciousness in a way that where we don't traditionally think about it. So anyway, I'm just going to skip it. So basically, we just don't know. I mean, I think um, I think they're really getting at something different that has not been used in the literature before, and it's just not well defined. So it's hard to say what they're talking about. Well, and then one other random objection from Scott Aronson, who used some of the older equations to say, well, look, I can put together some simple XOR circuits that can calculate as much phi as you want, and um, that seems absurd. And then they had this debate back and forth, and then they said, "Oh, no, that's not absurd. It's our intuitions that are wrong." That
Well,
we
Christoph actually sort of clarified that one for me.
Okay.
Made this was a very important point to him, was this objection and a few other things that we talked about, and it led to him making his very final bit that he wanted to say during the call, that he would hold up this piece of paper, this graph with two different dimensions. Consciousness on one end, that's one axis.
Hmm.
Intelligence is the other axis. The two are not in any way, like they're separate axes. They are orthogonal. You can have
Yeah.
something that is extremely conscious and completely unintelligent.
Yeah.
You can have something that is extremely intelligent but has no consciousness. That's what the point he's trying to make. They're two completely different things. So the XOR gates, extremely conscious but zero intelligence, or very
Which
little
is
intelligence.
so.
He was
I
meant.
agree. I saw him put up that chart.
Yeah,
It's
I've seen him. I think he talks about that in his book, actually, Keith. I think that he gets into that example
yeah.
in his book.
Does he
Um,
describe what it would mean to be a conscious but utterly unintelligent system?
that's the problem. And I would come back and say, well, the problem with that is that consciousness, if you look at the third person consciousness, is so intertwined with reportability and with intelligence that, um, empirically, that I think is the wrong way to look at things.
Yeah, I mean, it seems really weird to think that something could be really aware of itself but completely unintelligent.
Well, that's when you get into panpsychism, which is the theories talked about that, where every atom is incredibly conscious,
So
but
every
isn't.
atom is super aware of itself.
Wait. I realize that panpsychism says everything has a non-zero amount, but I thought it was, that, you know, thermostats kind of have neither. Like they have a little bit of consciousness, but they also have like this inkling of intelligence. It's not that atoms are super conscious, it's that they have like sort of the
Right.
minimum non-zero amount of consciousness, and they're also dumb as
Right.
rocks.
Well, and that's the integration problem. Is a panpsychism is how do you get from, okay, so every atom has a little bit of consciousness. So how do we get from that to like a human brain that has a lot of specific kind of a consciousness? And
That's
I think that's the
fine.
biggest problem with panpsychism is
That's
is
fine. I think we're all right now sort of pulling apart whether or not it's always possible that intelligence and consciousnness are not exactly the same thing. So they may have a correlation that's less than one.
Yeah, I
And
agree with
we're,
that.
we're,
Yeah,
we're trying to figure out here whether there's,
zero
whether
correlation.
it's reasonable to say that you
Yeah.
can have zero of one and one of the other.
Yep,
Right.
and I
I mean,
agree. And I think the best you
even
can say about that is it's very
right.
debatable, and that you're taking a pretty dogmatic position if you say that there's zero correlation.
Yeah. I,
Um,
correlation between the two is one issue, but even if they were both orthogonal, even if intelligence and consciousness are completely orthogonal, then you still have to ask whether IIT is the right way to describe consciousness, because if it's a self-modeling system that can be totally unintelligent, but it models itself, that's something very different than what IIT is going after.
well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of many different questions. So let's talk about. So the second part is the qualitative content. And I think this is less discussed with IIT because they've often focused on the phi, but this is, probably more important actually of the theory. And so the quality question is, what specific conscious experiences does a physical system have? More exactly, what is a complete set of psychophysical principles which, together with the physical facts, entail the precise qualitative conscious experience? So, in other words, why does pain feel the way it does? And could you come up with an equation that you'd say, okay, here's the system. Okay, here's this thing in quality of space, and they're feeling a light burning pain. That's sort of the holy grail of psychophysical laws. You could take a
Yeah.
system and say exactly what qualitative experience they're having, like the details. Oh, this feels like this because
Yeah.
it's got this
That is
structure.
that's exactly what I want. I want him to demonstrate that if you gave him some qualia shape in whatever sort of rigorous language this exists in,
Hmm.
for something that he was unfamiliar with, like
Exactly.
he may, it may be difficult to design the experiment because people like Koch and Tanani might, sort of comb the literature and become sort of intimately familiar with, Ned Block's
The correlate.
baths
Yeah.
and UVBs. It may be very hard to find an example, but let's just say that, in their scientific sort of research, they had overlooked the fact that birds can see, 100 meters away. They 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 can see, the polarization of sunlight. They just forgot that one. So, oops. Am I still on? Somebody froze.
And there's, of course you can't do that. I mean, they have these toy examples, but that's
I
such
dropped
a,
one.
that's such a incredible claim that it's almost hard to believe that they're making that. But
I dropped off,
so
didn't I? Sorry.
you're still there.
Oh, yeah. So I guess I think I lost my connection, but yeah, I want to show him the qualia shape of a bird's experience of polarization of light without him knowing what it is, and have him point to it and say, "Oh yeah, that's the qualia of polarization of light."
Exactly, that would be a test of the IIT. That would be a real example.
Yeah.
So Potts, so he kind of analyzed this a little bit about what do you mean by the qualitative content, and these are just some quotes from the paper. So rather than trying to understand the meaning of the activity of some elements, neurons in isolation, or even the distributed patterns of activity, which is how most of us would think about, well, that's how we're going to have to correlate with specific qualia. IIT claims that the meaning is only generated in terms of shapes, that is, in terms of a set of informational relationships generated by the concept. And um, he calls it T shape, but I just prefer Q shape since that's what Tononi talks about. Um, I'm not going to get into what similarity congruence means. So he said, but it's hard to believe that there is a different fundamental principle for each possible experience, because I think that's what you're going to have with this is for each shape, you're basically going to have to postulate that that is, a dark red, because there's really no getting around it. So you just have this massive shape where each experience is basically an axiom. And he says that this is very complicated and unlovely. A much simpler system would posit a handful of general systematic psychophysical principles from which more specific principles could be derived. And I think that's a devastating criticism right there. Is there any empirical evidence that supports the T-shaped theory? Absolutely not. Well, they also, the integrated information theorists concede that in practice is not possible to determine T for any toy system that has more than 5 or 6 or 7 nodes. So even they admit that it's untestable. So that's just another problem. So that's the end of the Potts paper. So any and this is just the last part is just going to be pretty brief. I don't want to get into too much of this, but any more thoughts on that particular paper? I mean, I think they're devastating criticism. I think that paper is just devastating. Um, to take apart your theory that much and say you don't know what you're looking at.
Has Koch responded to the paper?
No, I'm not even sure he's looked at the paper. I should.
I'm not sure he's aware of it either. I asked him several questions that derive directly from the paper, and I think that looking at his answers gives you some clue as to how he would respond to the paper. But I don't remember all of them right now. One thing that I wish I could remember at the moment is his best description of what it is that that Heather Berlin in their set of experiments for the Templeton Foundation are about to do to try to test IIT versus global workspace.
Yes, that big $10 million grant, which
Yeah,
is trying to compare IIT with global workspace using functional MRI. I mean, that should be interesting.
because I don't remember exactly what he responded there right now. We'd have to rewatch it again. But I do remember that he did admit that they were not going to be able to test some of the more fundamental things at this point. They were just going to try to compare uh, global workspace and IIT on their power to make certain predictions. I think.
Well, and that brings up a whole other. I mean, because there's a couple of these papers, like I said, that talk about trying to find consciousness in people who in vegetative states and stuff. And I really have a major problem with those studies is that basically have nothing to do with IIT. You could just say that these studies are looking at the level that, okay, to be conscious your brain has to be connected a little bit, and you could stop with that and then go with these studies and just look at someone who's conscious, get some correlations, start doing some looking at people that you're not sure about, getting some correlations. So I really think that's a major stretch. That some of these papers that they say are testing IIT, I think that's really absurd. I mean, if you look at those papers, they have nothing to do with any of this theory stuff. Is theoretical it goes is basically different parts of the brain should be talking to each other when you're conscious. And I mean, who wouldn't agree with that?
Yeah. I quickly want to mention that uh, Charmy Porwell, one of our members,
Mhm.
has posted a question in chat because she's unable to use the microphone properly at this moment. So she's asking, is perception synthesis equivalent to consciousness?
I'm not sure exactly what she means by perception synthesis. I mean, you could, I guess, I mean, in general, when people talk about perception, they're talking about, when psychologists are studying it, I mean, they're usually talking about conscious perception. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different theories about unconscious, levels of perception. But for the most part, when you're looking at perception, you're looking at conscious perception. So there's pretty much 100% overlap um, with perception. I'm not sure what synthesis, though. Maybe if they could clarify a little bit
Okay.
on what.
John Davis added to that perceptual synthesis, one, the integration of experience from all the senses to establish knowledge of the external world and one's interactions with it, and to eliminate unessential information about both.
So the original question was, how is that different from consciousness? I don't think it's that different. I think that's a subset of the questions about consciousness.
But doesn't this sort of presume that we're going with the third person approach to consciousness, kind of the global workspace thing? Because the first person one seems to be, how do you feel it? How is it that you feel so aware of it? How is it that it feels like this? Which is a little different than saying, oh, I'm able to integrate all of my different senses. Uh, and I guess that, again, the different ways that IIT and something like global workspace go about getting at the problem of consciousness.
Yeah, that's a good point because you could say that the IAT talks about that, but they talk about these phenomenological axioms where people sit back and they try to intuit their own experience, and it seems to be holistic and whatnot. And then you've got psychologists that want to actually look at do different studies about perception and how we integrate things, and that's very third person.
Yeah. By the way, it's interesting to add to this conversation that in talking to Christoph, I got the very clear impression that number one, he does not believe that there is a hard problem of consciousness, that this is
Interesting.
all solved by IIT. And secondly, he's totally comfortable with the idea of mind uploading. So as
Hmm.
long as you build your emulation on a system that is neuromorphic, so that it
Degenerates
self-produces
phi.
necessary
Mm.
phi,
Hmm.
he has no
No
problem,
issues.
for example, copy and scan and copy. So you can
Yep.
make as many Christophs as you like, they're all him.
Yeah,
Yep.
it's encouraging. You did try to ask him if he had any take on sort of the abstract metaphysics of all the various identity problems, and he made it clear he sort of. I'm not sure I completely disagreed with him actually that it's sort of not worth worrying about. I think that's kind of what I'm always trying to say. Stop worrying about it.
Well, that's interesting because a lot of times, I mean, I heard him say specifically that, and Tononi as well, that IAT actually solves the hard problem. So it's interesting that now he's saying that there is no hard problem.
Well, I
Is what
think same
is
thing. He,
what they mean that if you had a sufficiently rich understanding of these shapes and quality of space that's it, that it goes away at that point.
Well, that's the central problem is that they say that the quality of this first person consciousness is the shape,
That's
which is
fine.
identity theory. Which to me, I mean, that
But
doesn't
here's
really.
my problem. When I think people don't take David Chalmers at face value. When he describes the hard problem, I agree with him. He's really getting at something really deep. And even Ken Hayworth and I kind of disagree with about of this because Ken, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he's told me multiple times. He basically believes that if we get to the point where we have a sufficient understanding of the brain physically, he kind of feels like he will be able to put a cork in his personal search for consciousness. And I agree with David Chalmers that I just don't agree with that. And here's a perfect example. Let's say Tanani and Koch figure out a way to really truly calculate this
Hmm.
phi thing, and not
Yep.
only this, not only the phi metric, the one scalar, but also all these sort of shapes and all that stuff, right?
Yep.
So let's say that they figured out how to turn the experience of a bird seeing polarized light into a qualia shape, and you can write it down. The shape is described abstractly on paper. David Chalmers' hard problem is, what insight does that give you into the experience of a bird seeing polarized light?
Exactly. Or even like, why is that true? Why does that specific shape equal this qualitative first person experience? And that is the hard
Yeah.
problem. Exactly. Yep. I
And
totally agree with you there.
I am definitely one of these people who sort of throws my hands up. I don't see this ever being solved, and I'm not quite sure what it actually says about the nature of reality that I consider to be an unsolvable problem. But yeah, anytime somebody gets a little dismissive about the hard problem, I actually kind of come to Chalmers' defense. I really think they're not
Well, I
understanding
agree with you there. Actually, I think, and you and I had an interesting discussion with Ken about that the other day. Um, about the hard problem. So yeah, so that's let me get. So I think that's a point I wanted to make is that for people who believe, if you don't believe the hard problem, well, that doesn't matter. But if you take that seriously, then IIT just really
Yeah.
doesn't help you. Um,
I have one more thing to say about that before you get into
yeah, yeah.
the solution there. Just to sort of add to Keith's point. So obviously, the hard problem is something that bothers any one of us who thinks about the fact that we can think and feel like we're here and all of that. And this is, to me, it feels like it's actually where IIT comes from when he says it's cogito ergo sum. That's where he starts at. They really wanted to solve why it feels that way. They wanted to come up with something that would explain why that exists. Now, but when I think about it, sometimes I think it's a real problem that we need to solve, and sometimes I think this is the same problem as we have with the anthropic principle, with this notion that how come we live in a universe where all the parameters are set up just so that we exist? And then the answer to that, according to that principle, is well, of course, we are in such a universe. That's the only reason we can talk about it. So it's ridiculous to think about why are the parameters the way they are. And the people who would answer that, it's ridiculous to talk about why the parameters are set the way they are because this is the only universe where that question is possible, would be the same people who would say, well, of course it feels like you to be you in your brain because your brain is the only brain that can produce you, and therefore that is naturally the outcome. And thinking, how come I feel like I'm here and I'm me doesn't
Well,
make sense.
I don't. Um, I guess I'm not actually referring to the sense of identity. Um, and I'm not even like, people often sort of say, why is red red and green green? But to me, the question isn't why red and green are slightly different experiences of vision. To me, the question is, why does vision feel like vision and sound feel like sound? And I mean, that is, I don't
Okay.
know. I mean, I guess there are people who just think that's not an interesting question. They're just like, what? I mean, basically, they say, well, pain is painful because, what the hell else is it going to be? So that's what it's going to
I would
be.
go
But
at
that's
it
not a
in a
convincing
different
answer.
way. So I would say,
Yeah.
of course, vision and sound are going to feel different in some way because they're not processing the same type of information in the same way. So it's going to feel different in some sense. And the way it feels different is the way that sound feels different from vision. And so it's
I
circular.
I know, I know. No, and I'm not even denying that I can't. It's not like I know the answer. I'm waiting for everyone else to say, and I'm testing everybody. Like, I agree that I can barely frame this question, much less conceive of a satisfying answer. And I admit that. Just wish everybody else would admit it.
That's the way I feel about the hard problem. Absolutely. It's like I can't articulate it, but you know. So, and then what you were saying, Randall, I agree. I think co-continuity they basically acknowledge the hard problem when they talk about Descartes and this first person experience, as opposed to somebody like Daniel Dennett who wants to say that's an illusion. Just dismisses that or dismisses qualia. Um, so that's a different starting point. But then it's kind of interesting that you sort of acknowledge the hard problem, which is the existence of qualia, and then you kind of deny it later on. So that's interesting.
Yeah, but I do think that so Dan Dennett is an extreme case, right? But there are other people who talk about illusions, like Susan Blackmore. And when I talk to either Michael Graziano or Christoph Koch about Susan Blackmore, they both kind of agree with her more than they would Dennett, just
Hmm.
because she makes it very clear that when she says illusion, she just means it isn't the way it seems. And that I think is something you can apply here. If you're thinking um, that there's a problem there, because how could I, you know, that hard problem, which is so hard to describe, uh, that there's a lot of illusion involved, and this is
Hmm.
something that actually bugged me a bit about IIT and also about the some of the conversation around what must be obvious in the axioms, right? Because the obvious axioms, that's exactly where the illusions come into play. So, for instance, if one of your assumptions is that consciousness is something that is a it's an exclusionary or uniform thing, everything is put together in one, you are aware of everything, then I can debate that. I can say, how do you know it's not the same as vision, where you can't really see the picture, you just decide to focus on this bit and that bit and that bit, but you imagine that you have a whole picture in your mind. And in the same way, isn't when I ask myself, just like Susan Blackmore says, when I ask myself, what was I just conscious of? I don't suddenly remember the entire awareness of everything. I zip my mind back and forth between what was I hearing? What was I seeing? What was I tasting? What was I thinking about? And every time I do that, I'm paying attention to a different aspect of the results that my brain produces. And I'm picking them up out of a working memory where I've stored what those systems said they were doing at the time. And so it's post hoc and it's attentional. You zip back and forth between different things and you're using your memory. It's not as if I'm suddenly aware of the whole context. It's not like I feel like I am here and all of these things are there. No, I suddenly notice, oh yeah, there's a bird chirping back there because I'm
Hmm.
suddenly paying attention to that. And oh yeah, there's this thing I'm supposed to do tomorrow because I suddenly remembered that from my anxiety about what I'm supposed to do tomorrow or something like that. It's not a holistic experience at all.
Well,
That's
exactly. And those kind of things are never, those are going to be empirical questions. You're never going to figure that out just from, self, um, intuition. It's like you're talking about the illusion of visual experience. We think we have this, um, huge, picture of our whole visual experience, but it's just, the fovea, is the only small part of the visual field that you actually have that detail, and the rest of it is illusion. So you've got all those really interesting questions that, we discover all these different illusions as part of, perception, and you can't deny those because those are pretty basic science.
and
And
that
then, like you said,
becomes
then you've
a
got like
problem. Yeah, that's where it becomes a problem that this approach that they've taken takes your inner first person consciousness as
as
the metric as
as
the
infallible. Exactly. Yep. Yep.
because you're listening to the system and what it's reporting to itself. And if the system writes a report that says, I am at this moment aware of all those things at the same time, how can you falsify that? That's just the result that it decided to write. It's just like if you write a program that prints, I am conscious, and all it really
Exactly.
did was print that.
That's the illusion. Exactly. Well, this gets to, let me just skip to the meta problem because we're kind of getting on this, um, which is that I think, you really, most people would acknowledge, except for, a real outlier like, Hammer Off, most people would say that, obviously for every experience we have, including the statement, I feel this experience of red and it's unexplainable and it's part of the hard problem, that has a physical basis that supervenes on the brain. So, I think that really gets into, taking this, even a step further, and, saying that that's what IIT, I mean, IIT has no explanation for that. IIT has nothing to say about the meta problem, which is kind of what we talked about, the link between intelligence and consciousness. And that's, to me, that's sort of where the hard problem, you take it to, you start to think about the meta problem and the hard problem together. And, that I think is the, really taking it to the edge of what we can understand. Well, let me back. So just, let's see. So just a few minutes on just this last problem, and just maybe even 1 minute. So we've already talked about a lot of this, how IIT is not testable. I talk about the glaring example of lack of prediction about third person consciousness. So I'm not going to say too much more about that. IIT is not a functionalist theory, so that you can get into all kinds of arguments about, dancing qualia. I won't get into that. And gets back to, again, according to IIT, there's really no purpose of consciousness. It's a epiphenomenon, a metaphenomenon, which is I think a huge problem, and that's related to the meta problem. Talked about the hard problem, talked about the meta problem, and then there's arguments about the simulation argument, whoops, where water's not wet, and the feed forward arguments, which are a whole nother set of topics. Whoops, but that's kind of all the slides I have. So I think we can definitely just have some more discussion here.
By the way, that epiphenomena aspect, that was something that also came up in the conversation with Christoph, because of course he shows consciousness and intelligence as being orthogonal, and we talked about the evolution of consciousness at some
Hmm.
point. Clearly, it couldn't be linked into the evolution of intelligence because as we kept on
Yep,
talking about
different.
systems that were behaviorally better suited to surviving in the world, it was easy to say, well, I could write a software program that does all those things, and yet the software program would have a very low phi.
Or zero
And
if it's like feed forward. Yep.
right, right. And so his take on that was that yes, sure, in that sense, consciousness is epiphenomenal, and yet there is an evolutionary reason why our consciousness has grown as we evolved, and that's because it's tied to the physics that had to evolve, and it's because, according to him, say if you take a von Neumann computer, it's a very non-robust system, one that can break very easily, whereas a very parallel system, a neuromorphic system, is really robust. And so there was an evolutionary pressure or selection pressure for parallel systems to evolve rather than von Neumann systems. And those parallel systems that became more and more complex, that led to a higher phi. So the phi is in that sense epiphenomenal, but it's sort of semi-epiphenomenal in the sense that it's directly related to the physical system that is preferred by evolution. So you get the increased intelligence over time, but also the increase of more complex parallel systems, and the parallelism leads to the higher phi.
Yeah, but I mean, you can. The reason that that's conjectural is that you could explain it all a completely different way. You could say that because biological systems are so slow, uh, that the only conceivable way that evolution could ever produce animals capable of actually surviving in a world in which things move as fast as they move uh, is to harness parallel networks and even harness, let me see, is recurrence any faster, but definitely parallelism as opposed to just turning the brain into a gigantic feed forward network. You could just argue that you can't make an animal move fast enough that way, in which case the fact that evolution latched onto parallelism could have been for the pure expediency of survival, which leaves consciousness as it just leaves the whole question on the table. Well, then, so it's just this epiphenomenal
Yeah, I don't
veneer.
think I don't think that would make much of a difference to Christoph's point, because whether evolution latched onto parallelism because parallelism is more robust, or because parallelism allowed for greater speed, or for both, the point is that evolution latched onto parallelism, and parallelism implies higher phi.
Right, right. But I'm just saying that that does lead to the conclusion that phi and consciousness are themselves not an evolutionary motive. They're just epiphenomenal. They just rode along for free while evolution was producing systems that could
Yeah,
survive.
in a sense they would be if the if it's all about calculating phi. Now, of course, what we could do then in the end is we could just chuck away the entire phi-ness and the entire definition of IIT consciousness, and instead say, you know, the thing they want to talk about there is really parallelism, and that consciousness equals parallelism. And then it even makes sense when you look at it on a graph. You could say, yes, of course, intelligence and parallelism are, are there like two different axes on the graph. They are orthogonal. You can make extremely parallel systems that have no intelligence, and you can make very intelligent systems that have no parallelism. So instead of using the word consciousness or the word phi, we could just talk about parallel systems, neuromorphic systems. And if we put that everywhere in the text, wherever they use phi or consciousness, the text would all make sense.
Yep. And I think he has that graph in his book. Actually, I know it, that chart you're talking about. And I guess my problem with that and I think I sympathize with Keith here, is that it does seem so. You've got you got the evolution of these more complicated systems, but again, it still seems a complete coincidence that systems that are able to talk about their own consciousness happen to have high fi. I mean, to me, I think that still is just a magical parallel epiphenomenon, that it just so happens to coincide perfectly that these really, really high fi systems also happen to have third person consciousness, which is the
Yeah,
ability to say, oh, I self reflect, I have this self model. That's what I think that's just a complete, according to IIT, that just has to be a complete coincidence that occurs.
I totally agree. And so when I was just trying to lay out what Christoph was saying, and I was saying we could just replace consciousness and phi with parallel,
Hmm.
I'm just trying to be clear about what Christoph said, and also I'm proposing that what they're talking about is really just parallelism and nothing else. That they're coming up with measures for
They'd
parallelism.
be better off, exactly, talk about something like that.
Let's do architecture discussion, but it doesn't solve what we
Yeah,
care about when we talk about consciousness, which has to include, as you said, third
third
person.
person conscious. Yeah, I'd be interested to read a little bit too about Max Tegmark too, because he um, tries to take what we're really talking about to a more basic level of the fundamental physics. Um, take IIT, but just take it to the level of physics, and almost more like parallelism, or what are we talking about with matter? That actually would be he actually has a book and a paper that would be worth probably discussing, because I think in some ways I like his take better than Koch and Tononi, because it's just
Does he
actually more
address
basic.
third person consciousness?
What's that?
Does he address third person consciousness and explain?
Well, I mean, he's still got the same problems. Yeah, I think there's still those same problems there.
Um, well, wait. What theory of branching identity says that their brains are linked? I don't think I understand the question.
I
I
think maybe
think.
we're proposing a solution where the minds would be linked to overcome the branching aspect.
Oh,
Yeah, I think I sort of see what the question's asking. I guess at least when I wrote the 2015 paper, when I was talking about branching at the single instant of time where you have the two, um, right at the moment of branching, you could really say the systems are the same. That it's really sort of one consciousness. But the moment they start to evolve, they could become very different. They become very different conscious experience, or have different identity. And I guess in that paper, I was trying to say that we don't really have an intuitive understanding of branching, because it doesn't occur in our world. So um, I kind of was speculating, well, maybe in some ways they are. Um, they start out the same, but then they diverge. But just we can't talk about you know our intuition about what would really what would it feel like to do that, to branch. I mean, would it really be you in both branches? Um, I don't know that we have that intuition, and so you could make a case for either one, but it's a little bit of guessing there, and I think that's what's interesting about it. I mean, we just don't have intuition about those kind of questions. I'm probably a little bit less dogmatic than I was when I wrote that paper. I mean, I'm more open to saying that we really don't know, but I think we have to admit that we just don't have that intuition, and here's the possibilities. They could be in ways that we don't understand now. Very much linked, so that your survival would continue in all these scenarios. Um, but they're really hard questions, and I admit I really don't have the best I can do is just set up the possibilities of what it could be, but um, as far as saying for sure, I just don't know. But a very interesting questions though.
I think that these questions are really hard because they ask of us to evolve or let go of our intuitions in some sense. But I do think that there is hope in the sense that I think we've had intuitions in the past that turned out to be incorrect, such as, we are the center of the universe and that sort of thing. And we got over that. We managed to adjust how we see things because we are taught from an early age to look at things differently. So I think that there's hope, first of all. And I think that when it comes to identity, there are a number of things that we probably have to modify when we learn to think about it more carefully. Speaking of learning to think more carefully, I do not actually know how one would go about creating a perfectly linked biological and uploaded mind, but that's a whole separate question.
Well,
Um,
that's a great. I mean, we should definitely
yeah,
have a journal club about
we
identity.
would have
Well,
just a journal
yeah.
club. I think we're going to have a workshop on personal identity because
Yeah,
it's really necessary.
yeah.
But but the thing that I think is important when we think about branching identity and about that is to not just think, okay, there's a branch point, but to also think about differences in identity. Because the problem often is that people will assume that identity is a one or zero thing. You are either equal to Michael Cerullo or you are not equal to Michael Cerullo. I don't think that's true. I think that Michael Cerullo yesterday is 95% Michael Cerullo today. I think that Michael Cerullo at five
Right.
years of age is perhaps only 1% Michael Cerullo today. And I
I think
think
the
that
reason,
if you have branch points, then those two Michael Cerullos one day later will be still largely the same. So you could say that Michael Cerullo B is survived to 95% in Michael Cerullo A if those branches are called A and B.
yeah, but you can, I
It's
mean,
complicated
I
to
don't
think,
just,
but it's important.
but you can see the counter argument is that it's whether people get sort of wrapped around the axle about their stream of consciousness, and to be 95% preserved in some other physical entity is not to say that your sense of survival is in any way uh, that you're any more comfortable with your death on the knowledge that there's a 95% perfect sort of clone in the next room. um, I think that I personally don't really sort of buy those arguments, but that's why people aren't interested in sort of imperfect blends of identity, because they feel like, well, their stream of consciousness, which
Yeah.
I don't think exists, doesn't have that property.
No, you're right. There are several different things that need to be addressed in talking about personal identity, and the stream of consciousness is certainly one of them. And in the paper that you and I wrote about the fallacy of making a difference between gradual and scan and copy, that several of those things also we attempted to address those. Um, One exercise that I went through recently in talking with Michael Ulrich actually was that instead of thinking um, about the step from biological self to uploaded self, we thought instead about uh, software emulations and what if you make a copy of a software emulation, because we were trying to think through this whole stream of consciousness thing and gradual um, versus instantaneous. And because in the software version there are these clock ticks between every step in the software, it's pretty easy to show that there a gradual replacement is actually the same as an instantaneous replacement is actually the same as a scan and copy. So the whole thing that we tried to argue in the paper becomes even easier to show if you're talking about the duplication of already uploaded selves, which
Sure.
shouldn't be any different in principle than our biological selves, except that we're assuming that there's some kind of clock tick going on. Now, are there clock ticks in our human existence? Well, in a sense, there are. First of all, what about someone who has been brain dead, like the case of the hypothermic surgery? There's certainly a big clock tick going on there, a big interval between one moment and the next. And also, even in our regular brain activity, when we go to sleep and we lose a lot of what we would normally call our stream of consciousness, or just between gamma cycles in our brain if you want to, all of those are arguable, but there is some similarity there in the problem. Yeah, this is a huge topic in itself.
There's also within physics the concept of Planck time, which is analogous to Planck length. And Planck time is this measure of time which actually turns physical reality into discrete chunks of time. I mean, so I mean, in some sense, everything is you have to accept that you can interpret your stream discretely, one way or another.
So yeah, to those of you listening who are members of the Carboncopies organization, one thing I'd like to point out is that we will be talking about personal identity a lot more coming up, because it's the natural follow-up to talking about consciousness. And it's also one of the things that is most fundamental to a person's interest in whole brain emulation and mind uploading. Within Carboncopies, we've started a document where we try to have an internal conversation, a discussion, or at least a debate between some different views on what would constitute a successful upload versus an unsuccessful upload, based around mostly personal interpretations of what it means to survive an upload. So what it means to have personal identity. And yeah, we're going to continue working on that document for a while, and then we'll add on some interviews and a workshop to get this conversation rolling as well. So was that actually your whole presentation at the moment, Mike, or did you have more?
No, that was the end of the slides and everything I wanted to cover. I mean, clearly there's more there, but that's a whole, that's almost a separate, any of those last objections could be a separate journal club, because there's some other really interesting articles out there, critiques of IIT that take different approaches.
What would be your summary takeaway from this one?
My summary take would be that, well, the one that IIT is a very unique theory, and that, you really we need to know more about both quantity of consciousness and quality of consciousness. And before we get too, wrapped up in the details, I think we need some answers to those, those two questions, before we can really take that theory seriously as a scientific theory.
Thanks. Thank you very much for presenting this paper.
Yeah, it was a good discussion. Very, I mean, and what I like about theory too, I mean, I know I've critiqued it a lot, but it does bring up a lot of fascinating questions and makes you think a lot about these questions of consciousness and in ways that we really haven't thought about before. So, in that way, I think it's been a great theory to bring up all of these approaches, and it is unique. I mean, there's been nothing that's been quite like this before.
Does anyone else still want to say something about consciousness and about this journal club?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. And we don't have any further questions waiting on the YouTube stream. All right. Looks like we're done for today.
All right, and now just to ask a question about the journal clubs in general, is it normally the first Saturday of every month? Is that, or sorry, the first Sunday?
Yeah, normally that's how we do it. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yes, of course. This is the thing that we usually have to do at the end of a journal club, is we look
Find
for
another volunteer.
Yeah. Does anyone who's here right now want to give it a go?
I'd have to think about it.
But Michael, haven't you already done one? You want to do another? Okay. Yeah. I mean, if no one else wants to go right now, then I think you totally do that. Awesome. Thank you. All right. Well, thanks everyone. Guess we're closing off the YouTube live stream and done.
Good night, everyone.
All right.
Bye-bye all.